In this week's study, we're talking about how to keep relationships going strong, how to not only maintain our valued relationships, but how good relationships actually can get better by overcoming basic challenges that every relationship faces. For example, if a relationship is growing, it's going to face conflict. There's going to be things said or done that cause offense or hurt feelings. There's going to be issues that come up that need to be corrected. And a lot of people deal with these issues by just letting the relationship slide or letting it stagnate because they don't want to make waves. And so a great relationship might get left by the side of the road as you just move on in your life. And that's really a tragedy that we can't maintain those relationships. And in thinking about that, sometimes we need to forgive. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. And sometimes you need to be the one who asks for forgiveness. Sometimes you need to maybe confront a problem that's between you and another person. And that's what the other teaching elements will cover this week. So let's talk about forgiveness. Jesus brought this up in Matthew chapter 18. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?' And Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times.'" So Peter's asking a question about forgiveness that you may have had occasion to ask at some time. How far does forgiveness go? How many times do I need to forgive? And Peter thought he was being generous when he suggested, up to 7 times. But Jesus' response probably then surprised him. He said not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, Jesus wasn't saying that you don't have to forgive on the 78th offense, but he was essentially saying forgive without limits. He might as well have said 7 to the 7th power times. He was saying just more than you can imagine, keep on forgiving. And then in the verses that follow, he told a parable to illustrate the scope of forgiveness. He says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. And since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt," it says. So there's this first servant who owed the king $1 bajillion, 10,000 bags of gold. That's just a way of saying an unimaginable amount. And the king forgave the debt. He just canceled it, as large as it was, because the servant had pleaded with him to do that. Now, in fact, the servant only asked for patience. He didn't ask the debt to be canceled. The master did far more than was even requested. Now, let's see what happens next in the story as this servant goes out and interacts with someone else. It says, "When the servant went out from meeting with the master, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt." So that same servant was owed money by a different servant. He owed him 100 silver coins, maybe $1,000, It was a lot of money. He couldn't pay it, but it was far, far short of these thousands of bags of gold that this one had been forgiven. And the second servant said exactly the same thing that the first servant said. He said, "Be patient with me. Give me time. I'll pay it back." But he refused to be lenient. Instead, he had his debtor hauled off and thrown into jail until he could pay the debt. What happened next, it says, is that the other servants saw what happened. They were outraged, went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the first servant in. "You wicked servant," he says, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owes. So I'm sure you can see the point that Jesus is making. We're like that first servant because in Christ, God has forgiven you and I of like an infinite debt. It's the debt of all of our sin against God. Every sin you ever committed in your whole life, whether in motive, in thought, in word, in deed, Jesus bore that on the cross. And God said, I'm not going to make you pay the price for all of your sin. God has forgiven us abundantly in Christ. And so then when a person wrongs you or offends you in some way, small or large, and you turn around, and how can you and I then refuse to forgive that other person? Even the greatest offense against you or I doesn't even begin to compare with our offense against God. That's why Jesus tells Peter, not 7, but 77 times, we who've received an unlimited forgiveness from God should be willing to forgive others as freely and as abundantly as we've been forgiven. And the Apostle Paul understood this. He wrote about this in Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. He said, bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. So forgiveness is not optional. Again, God himself is the model. He says, forgive how? As the Lord forgave you. Think about how God has forgiven us. God forgave me infinitely, abundantly, freely, unconditionally. He's forgiven me generously, with kindness, with mercy. He forgave me once and for all of my sins. He doesn't hold any of them against me anymore. He says that's how we are called to forgive. And so, if you've been forgiven of your sins by God, there is no possible justification for you to withhold forgiveness from someone else. There's just simply no argument that you can make that holds water for why one forgiven so greatly does not become a great forgiver. Now, one more thing I want to share, and that is that forgiveness is both a decision and a process. And I heard a story that helped me understand how that works. Corrie ten Boom was a prisoner in a World War II concentration camp. She'd been helping Jews escape the Nazis, and after what she suffered in the camp and what she saw there and what her family went through in concentration camp, you can imagine it would be hard for her to forgive those people. But she said this analogy helped her. She said, think of a bell up in a tower, perhaps a tower above a church. And there's a rope that moves that bell, and the harder you pull the rope, the louder and longer the bell rings. Nursing a grievance is like pulling on the rope. And the decision to forgive is like taking your hands off the rope, where you stop putting emotional energy into that grievance. But even when you stop pulling the rope, the bell continues to peal for a while. It still swings back and forth from the energy that you already put into it previously. But eventually, when you take your hands off the rope, the noise from the bell will start to die out, unless, of course, you give the rope a yank again. But the emotions of forgiveness are like that. You made the decision to forgive, but your emotions may take a while to catch up to your decision. They have their own energy for a while, yet eventually they will die down. And so you can forgive. In fact, you must forgive if you're the one who has experienced God's forgiveness yourself. Now, here are some questions as you pause the video that will help you to process and think about this issue of forgiveness.